The dust rose in slow golden spirals over the Wyoming plains as the truck came to a stop beside a long stretch of wooden corral. The women inside blinked against the sunlight, thin, uniformed, and silent. They were Japanese PS, captured nurses and auxiliaries shipped across the Pacific to this unlikely place, a cattle ranch turned prison camp. Waiting for them were cowboys, broad-shouldered men in sweat-darkened hats, spurs glinting in the light. One of them, a man named Walt, spat into the dirt and pointed toward the barn. Feed's got to be hauled before sundown. The women looked at one another, bewildered. They had expected soldiers, not ranch hands, yet within minutes they were handed pitchforks and sacks, their slender arms straining under the weight. By evening their hands blistered, their hair dust-caked. But when the bell rang for supper they froze again because the cowboys lined up behind them. "Ladies first," Walt said. No one moved. The world had turned upside down. The engines had barely cooled when the order came. "Out, line up." The Japanese women stepped from the truck into sunlight so bright it stabbed their eyes. They had expected concrete walls, guard towers, maybe snarling dogs, and shouted commands. Instead, they found themselves in the middle of what looked like a cattle ranch. The ground was hard-packed earth, the air thick with the smell of hay, manure, and smoke from a distant cook fire. Beyond the fences stretched rolling hills the color of old brass, dotted with cattle that grazed lazily as if unaware that a war had ever been fought. The women blinked, disoriented, their uniforms, once crisp, hung in tatters. Some carried satchels, others clutched nothing at all. They had crossed an ocean in silence, packed shoulder to shoulder in the dark holds of a transport ship. Each had been told that capture was a stain worse than death, that the Americans would humiliate them, starve them, strip them of their dignity. Yet now, as the wind carried the scent of cut grass instead of gunpowder, their terror gave way to confusion. The journey to the strange place had felt endless. From the Philippines to San Francisco, then by train through plains that seemed to go on forever. Through the narrow windows they had seen children waving, factories humming, towns untouched by bombs. America was too vast, too alive. It was a landscape that mocked their suffering. In their homeland, entire cities had been flattened. Here, white barns stood upright, painted and proud, their roofs gleaming like silver under the sun. Some of the women turned away from the window, ashamed to look at so much order. Others pressed closer, whispering that perhaps the enemy's wealth was proof of their ruthlessness. Still, the sight of endless fields and open sky lodged deep in their minds, an image that refused to fit inside the cage of hatred they had been taught to carry. When the train finally stopped, they were herded into trucks and driven across dirt roads that wound through valleys and hills. Hours later, they arrived at the camp, if one could call it that. Barbed wire framed its perimeter, but inside stood wooden barns, corrals, and water towers. Horses snorted in the distance, a windmill turned lazily against the horizon. It was less a prison than a world in between, neither freedom nor captivity, but something suspended between the two. The women exchanged uneasy glances. One muttered that perhaps this was only a trick, a stage before cruelty began. Another whispered that she had seen this kind of land in an American postcard once back when such images had been used to frighten them. Pictures of cowboys and deserts meant to symbolize savagery, yet now those same symbols felt strangely peaceful. Their eyes fell on the men approaching them, Americans but not soldiers as they had imagined. They wore wide-brimmed hats instead of helmets, boots streaked with mud instead of polished leather. Their movements were unhurried, their rifles slung loosely over their shoulders. One spat tobacco into the dirt, another tipped his hat with a faint grin, and the gesture sent a ripple of unease through the women's ranks. Kindness was not part of their training manuals. These were the supposed barbarians. Their laughter, low and easy, drifted through the dry air. A young woman named Aiko watched one of them remove his gloves, revealing hands rough with calluses. He looked her over briefly, not with cruelty, but with the detached curiosity of a man sizing up a new horse for the pasture. Then he simply nodded and said, "You'll be fine here, ma'am." The title, polite and absurd in this setting, made her heart pound. The women were shown to their quarters, wooden barracks that smelled of cedar and dust. Straw mattresses lined the walls, each with a folded blanket. To them it felt like a trick. They had slept on concrete floors in the mud under tarps. Clean bedding seemed almost sinister. Outside, the cowboys went about their routines with practiced ease, driving trucks, loading hay, tending to animals. Their banter filled the camp like a soundtrack of normal life, utterly alien to those who had known only the rhythm of war. Aiko stood by the window that first night, staring out at the barbed wire glinting in the fatting light. The wire should have made her feel trapped, but instead it looked almost ornamental, like the thin outline of a cage drawn across a vast, indifferent sky. For the first time since her capture, she felt the faint stir of something she could not name. It was not hope, not yet, it was disbelief softening into wonder. The next morning a bell rang across the camp. A cowboy's voice called out in English, the words slow and heavy but the meaning clear enough. Work was waiting. The women stepped outside, the dew still wet on the grass, the mountains pink in the dawn. Ahead of them stood the same men from yesterday, their faces hidden by the shade of their hats. One of them smiled faintly and pointed toward the barn. "Feed's got to be hauled before sundown." The women stared, uncertain, and so began the strangest chapter of their captivity, a life measured not by chains or commands but by the rhythm of the plains. The morning light spilled across the ranch like molten gold, glinting off tin roofs in the slow sway of the windmill. The Japanese women lined up outside the barn, their shadows long and thin in the dust. A cowboy named Walt stood before them, thumbs hooked in his belt, explaining something in English they could barely understand, but his tone, steady, patient, spoke clearly enough. He pointed to a row of burlap sacks piled high, each stamped with black letters. Cattle feed. The women hesitated. It was hard labor, yes, but not the cruelty they had braced for. One woman, her name lost to history, took the first step forward. She bent, lifted, and staggered under the weight. The others followed, their movements jerky at first, uncoordinated. The sun beat down mercilessly, baking the dirt until it shimmered. Within minutes the air filled with the sounds of labored breathing, rustling cloth, and the faint rhythm of work being learned from scratch. The women's confusion deepened with every passing hour. They had been taught that punishment was the enemy's language. Where were the shouts, the blows, the sneers? When one stumbled, she expected a rifle butt or mockery, but instead the nearest cowboy reached out, steadying her with one hand. "Easy there," he murmured almost kindly. The words rolled past her, uncomprehending, but the tone made her chest tight. She lifted the sack again. The repetition became hypnotic. Bend, lift, carry, drop. The feed dust clung to their skin, mixing with sweat until their faces turned gray with grime. But there was something almost honest about it. Work was work. It hurt, but it did not humiliate. By midday the sun was a white ice staring down without mercy. The women's uniforms, already frayed, were soaked through with sweat. Aiko felt her arms tremble as she hoisted another sack. She had fainted once months ago in the Philippines and been beaten for it. Now as her knees buckled, she waited for anger. None came. Instead, a shadow fell over her. It was Walt again, his voice calm as he set down his own load beside her. He reached for his canteen and held it out. She froze, water offered from an enemy's hand. Her training screamed against it. He tilted his head slightly as if to say, "Go on." Slowly she took it. The water was warm, tasting faintly of metal and dust, but it slid down her throat like salvation. When she handed the canteen back, their eyes met just for a moment, and something unspoken passed between them. It was not friendship, not yet, but it was the first fracture in the wall of fear. The cowboys worked alongside the women, their movements smooth and economical. They rarely barked orders. Instead, they led by example. "Use your legs," one said, demonstrating the motion with a sack slung over his shoulder. "Don't fight it, flow with it." The words meant little, but his gestures spoke volumes. Slowly, the women began to mimic their rhythm. The rough work turned almost graceful, like a dance in silence. Aiko noticed how the men spoke to one another without cruelty, teasing lightly, trading jokes she couldn't understand but could feel through their laughter. Even when a woman dropped her load and cursed under her breath in Japanese, the cowboys laughed, not mockingly but with amusement. One of them even repeated the strange word she'd said, mangling it completely, and she found herself laughing too. It startled her, that sound. Laughter in captivity felt like a crime. By late afternoon, the air shimmered with heat. Dust rose in clouds, turning every figure into a moving blur.